Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
As global tensions rise and multilateralism faces new tests, China proposes a new framework, the Global Governance Initiative. What exactly does it offer? How's the world responding? And how may it reshape the global governance and world order? Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Xu Yawen in Beijing. In today's program, we will delve into key principles of China's Global Governance Initiative and discuss how it might improve global governance. To listen to this episode again or catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, a moment for the international community to reflect not just on the legacy of global cooperation, but also on the deep challenges confronting global governance today. When division replaces cooperation as the key word for some international issues, reconstructing a fairer and effective global governance system has become a shared task and responsibility for all nations. Against this backdrop, Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed the Global Governance Initiative, a new vision grounded in sovereign equality, abiding by international rule of law, multilateralism, people-centered approaches, and taking real actions. What does this initiative mean in practical terms? How is it being perceived around the world? And can it truly reshape the architecture of global governance? To explore these questions, I'm joined by three distinguished guests. Professor Pei May, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Professor Zha Daojiong, a Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University. And Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney, a Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. So let's begin by discussing why do we need to reform the global governance system in the first place? And this is a question for you, Professor Zha. We know in the past few years, the world has faced multiple overlapping crises, from the COVID pandemic to climate emergencies, from food and energy insecurity, and persistent geopolitical tensions. And these challenges have exposed the deep cracks in our global governance mechanisms and raising questions about effectiveness, fairness, and inclusion. Under this context, what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing today's global governance system, and why do you think the call for reform has now become a broad global consensus?
Well, in part, I don't think it's a vocabulary play. I want to categorically reject that. But the fact of the matter is when we discuss such issues, there is indeed a word play in place. International cooperation, global affairs, global governance, or order, rules-based order, world order, international order, liberal order. No, this is not just each of these matters. And if you go with, actually, each of those expressions would lead to a particular assessment of whether or not word we are having at this point of time. Of course, this point of time can be yesterday, can be the reference time frame can be different. What I'm really trying to say is that I would think from reflecting what we see here in China is that, look, with a large number of international issues, you've got war, you have development, you also have trade and investment, multilateral institutions. The UN is being left aside, the WTO is being left aside. Seemingly, people accept this as, number one, people accept this as normal. And number two, you have an increasing tendency to say, well, it's normal because those institutions have no longer served the purpose of especially this notion of a liberal international order. So here in China, we are better at saying, well, the situation is not satisfactory or is not in line with the wish on the part of China or on the part of other countries we may conveniently call global south to improve their lot in the world. But on the other hand, from, let's say, the global north or something, global west, there was your complaint about that gap is precisely the problem. So yeah, we are a bit at a loggerheads looking at the situation around the world. I think out of that, here in China or from other parts of the world, that you have emergence of voices who keep saying, let's give it a try, nonetheless.
Professor Mahoney, as Professor Zha just mentioned, nowadays there's dysfunctional international organizations. There is also growing concern about the weakening of multilateralism and increasing fragmentation in the international system. Some even refer to governance deficit. How do you see the current state of multilateralism? Would you agree that the global governance system is experiencing a governance deficit? And how serious is the challenge, if so?
Well, I'm gonna go directly to your question, but I'd like to embellish something that Professor Zha said. I think that one of the challenges that we see is that in the United States, where we're seeing a breakdown in governance within the United States, that this is being projected in terms of how the United States treats global governance. So the U.S. doesn't have trust in its own governance system. Why would they have trust in a system like the UN? Furthermore, we know that conservatives, of which Trump belongs to that ideological corner, have been at odds with the United Nations for a very long time. And one of the key developments in that we would have seen in 1971 when U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater said that he would be supporting the United States to halt all funding to the United Nations after Beijing took over the China seat from Taipei on the UN Security Council. So that we have sort of that side, but at the same time, in China, we have a very different perspective on governance. It's a watchword of the president. The Chinese take great pride in governance, and it sort of horrifies them that we have such disorder globally. So there's really sort of two very different perspectives on governance and the capacity for governance, even at the domestic level, which I think has tremendous reverberations globally. But to get to your point about a governance deficit, on the one hand, let's be clear that there's sort of three issues here. The first is there have always been institutional shortcomings in the global governance system. We've always had problems with not having sufficient democracy, for example, in the United Nations. We've always had situations where certain powerful countries played outsized roles in institutions like the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and others. So this is something that's always ended up, I think, producing shortfalls in terms of what we would otherwise hope, idealistically speaking, from the global governance system. The second is there are absolutely deficits even when the system works. So one of the things I think that we point to in the United Nations is the tremendous efforts that are made towards peacekeeping, and certainly we know China supports these tremendously. Bringing more troops to that effort than all the other permanent members of the UN Security Council combined. But even so, we know that the UN has not always lived up to what we would hope in terms of maintaining peace. Certainly, we see that problem as it relates to Ukraine today. And certainly, thirdly, we have just complete breakdowns. So, for example, and sometimes all three of these things are related, but for example, in the case of Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinians, what we see is that the UN is completely impotent to stop this genocide and apartheid from happening. And keeping in mind that 80 years ago, when the United Nations was formed, it was formed substantially to prevent precisely these kinds of atrocities. So in each case, I think we can see that there have always been longstanding failures to live up to the full potential. There have always been shortcomings, even when the system was working to some extent. But in some cases, we've seen complete breakdowns.
Professor Lee, what's your take on Professor Zha and Professor Mahoney's remarks on the current global governance system? And as a scholar from Malaysia, do Southeast Asian countries feel sidelined in the current system? And what kinds of reforms are they urgently calling for?
Well, I do agree. Actually, if we look at the current global governance systems, especially the key institutions like UN, it's actually not totally failing. It has done some great work in the past. For example, their World Food Program and also their SDGs. So they have a lot of UN agencies that have been contributing to alleviating poverty, addressing hunger, and then also helping with developing countries to manage climate change. So there are indeed, the good things that have been done by UN. And therefore, even, currently China is introducing this global governance initiative, right? They didn't ask for a replacement of the key institutions, but what they actually push for is the reform. So in other words, I think international community will still believe in UN. But of course, like what Professor Zha and Professor Mahoney pointed out, it is in certain issues like the Gaza issues, they are not actually addressing it very effectively, mainly due to the veto power exercise. So you ask what are kind of reforms that Southeast Asian countries actually would want to have. One of the things that Malaysia has been pushing for is to have the expansion of the membership of the United Nations Security Council, because like what has been said, the whole global order has been designed after World War, during the World War II, and then afterwards it has been followed by many countries, right? So mainly this global order existed after the World War II. So what it actually means that the needs of the countries today is very different from the needs of the country like that decades ago. So therefore, one of the things that Malaysia think needs to be reformed is to expand the membership in the United Nations Security Council to reflect the interests and also the voices of the developing countries. So for example, I think Africa, they have so many countries that deserve one of the permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council. So from these, so our assessment is that the current global governance system is probably a bit undemocratic, less democratic and less just. So therefore, we have to push for a reform of that.
Let's now take a closer look at what China is proposing through the Global Governance Initiative, or GGI. Professor Zha, so President Xi Jinping proposed this global governance initiative with the aim of improving global governance based on 5 core principles, namely sovereign equality, the international rule of law, multilateralism, a people-centered approach, and a focus on delivering real results. How do you assess these 5 core principles, and what new ideas or innovations does it bring to the table?
China is not the only government that comes up with tables such initiatives. The timing for the tabling is in many ways seasonal. Every year in September, we have debates, a new round of debates at the United Nations General Assembly, and every year China proposes this. And I have indeed noticed that this year's proposal is more general. It talks about the principles. Its wording, the number of words is way smaller, although the issues covered are less specific, but nevertheless it goes into some of the fundamental issues of principles, or you can call philosophy. I've compared both the Chinese and English versions to it. The 5 points principles are very clear, stated in terms of the kind of results we want to see. And that's, I believe, in terms of the goal for what the global governance results in, it's quite clear. And then certainly this is just, like I said, one of the many proposals we want to use this. I think this can function as a platform for further conversations on each of the points, how we can go forward and where we can find the commonalities in substance. But then out of the 5, I would think the points 3 to 5 are probably worthy greater attention. One is the multilateral. Multilateral does not necessarily mean as many as possible. The UN certainly is one of these, but minilateral or that multilateral can be initiated by a number of countries. And then the people focused, that is to say, the welfare of individuals. I know this is indeed in line with the larger concept of human security or human-centered approach, human welfare center, different ways of expressing in English. The last one, that is to say, the end goal, I think that is not about restoring or safeguarding, or however you frame that, the so-called liberal order or Western or US-led order or West-led order or China-led order. Now, the results needs to be matched by the people-centeredness. So the results needs to be measured by the level of acceptability on the part of as many actors and stakeholders as possible. So I think it's a good basis that can attract greater interest in discussion around the world.
Professor Zha, actually, China has also implemented the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, namely mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So could you elaborate on what are these 2, the Global Governance Initiative and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, their similarity and difference, and how does the GGI build on or reinterpret the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence?
Well, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence has a long history, and in terms of the very original wording, it was actually what's called the Panjshir principles. It had a very heavy Indian element of contribution to that at the Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia. That was the first Asia-Africa conference that was organized by the newly independent states. And it eventually became, here in China and in many other global South countries, a guiding principle for their practice foreign policy. I think the Global Governance Initiative is in many ways a different way of affirming the basic principle, and that is respect for sovereignty and respect for the autonomy in decision-making rather than imposing on one version or the future, insisting on the future being destined according to one particular set of historical tradition or legal tradition. To answer your question short, I think this is a continuation and in many ways a reaffirmation of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is China champions, but it has a historical basis that's more global South, and it's a solid proof that it works in the practices of diplomacy by many countries.
Professor Mahoney, President Xi Jinping emphasized the values such as sovereign equality, people-centered development, and taking real actions in Global Governance Initiative. In your view, how do these values differ from traditional Western-led governance models, and to what extent might the GGI complement or even help to reform the current international system?
Well, I think to build on, again, some of the things that Zha Daojiong was saying, starting with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and of course his point about it being already a document that has attracted a lot of admiration and support through the Global South since it was first proposed. I think the key here is that certainly some of the main qualities of the 5 principles, we see this not just in terms of what is being proposed by the Global Governance Initiative, but we also see this as being a constituent element in what China in the new era of major country diplomacy describes as its principles-based foreign policy. Now, one could argue that China has always had a principles-based foreign policy, but this has been something that has really been more clearly enunciated and and promoted, particularly as China has played increasingly instrumental roles in fostering what I think is clearly a new model of multilateralism, such that what we've seen in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, and that's in terms of multilateral ties. We've also seen China innovating new practices for bilateral ties, and here we can see the win-win approaches associated with the Belt Road Initiative. So I think that the point is that all of these things, all of these various initiatives, whether it's the Belt Road Initiative or the previous initiatives like the Global Security Initiative, the Global Culture Initiative, or Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, these are intersecting components of a broad vision that is aiming to create an equitable and inclusive basis for advancing a shared future for mankind. And I think China has experienced some tremendous success with the development of the SCO and the maturation of the SCO, which we saw a week ago with the meetings in Tianjin, and then which was also where we saw the introduction of the Global Governance Initiative. So these are all part of a much broader effort to not replace key institutions like the United Nations, but to innovate more equitable, democratic, inclusive, principles-based systems to show that they actually work, as we've seen now with SCO and BRICS. And of course, we see that one of the mandates for the SCO coming out of Tianjin is that they're going to be focused on precisely these sort of three final points that Zha Daojiong pointed out as being key aspects. So I think what we see is China helping to articulate and organize and move forward these new models of and practices associated with multilateralism, and to use these perhaps as case studies or as ways to learn lessons, so that we could then export those reforms. And let me make 2 points here that are kind of interesting. I agree that with Zha Daojiong that things like the Panchil or the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, these certainly have some origins from outside of China, although Zhou Enlai was a big developer and promoter of these. But I think that we also have to point to Chinese tradition. We have to point to values like emphasizing common ground and reserving differences. We have to look at some of these older principles in Chinese civilizational wisdom that are now being recalled and developed and used as China is trying to not step into the vacuum being created by the United States to then simply become the new superpower, but to actually realize a very different, more equitable model, and above all, because what China understands, I think, better than any other country in the world is if we look at all the various problems, and we can point to the biggest problem by far is global climate change. And we hear from Guterres, the UN General Secretary, that this issue is the world is still failing to come to terms with this. But at the same time, we see China has become the world leader in green innovation and development. That China, more than any other country, is rapidly undertaking a green transformation. That China is now using the Belt Road Initiative to push these technologies and these capacities to the rest of the world, especially the Global South, keeping in mind that the Global South, including China, are the countries most vulnerable to climate change, and that seeing that climate change is now directly linked. It's one of these singularities that is intersecting with other singularities like pandemics, growing conflict, the paradigm shifting technologies. All of these things are coming together at the same time, and China realizes that the only way that we can move forward together and create that shared future for humanity is that we have to come up with a better global governance system, and it has to be more equitable, otherwise it won't work.
Let's take a short break. When we return, we will take a closer look at how the world is responding to China's global governance initiative. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
Welcome back to World Today. I'm Xu Yawen. Earlier, we explored the core principles behind China's global governance initiative. Now let's return to how the world is responding and what role the initiative might play in improving global governance. Professor Li, so what are your take on what just Professor Mahoney and Professor Zha said about China's role and this proposal of this global governance initiative? And also, since it was released, how did ASEAN and other Asian countries respond to this initiative?
I think this China's global governance initiative, the purpose of introducing this is to provide stability against the backdrop of protectionism and also unilateralism and nationalism. And it comes at an opportune moment. I think this is much needed at this time because as we understand how chaotic it was in the last few months with the Liberation Day, with the tariff imposed on countries by the United States. So I think this is, of course, the China's global governance initiative comes at a very relevant time. So as what both panelists have said, I think one of the reasons why, countries like in the Southeast Asia, we actually embrace this and also celebrate this is because it resonates with what we want. We want a global governance system which can reflect our voice, which actually promotes and upholds multilateralism, and it's not only dictated by specific power. So this kind of system will allow, developing countries to actually have its own development path rather than having one size fits all approach that was being promoted by the, so-called rule-based governance system in the past. So for example, I think Malaysia Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, we said that Malaysia strongly supports China's global governance initiative. Apart from that, I think Indonesian President Prabowo also supported this initiative because this initiative basically reflects the commitment of the countries to defend multilateralism. And of course, when we talk about, Professor Mahoney talks about the other initiative that was being introduced by China, like Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative. All of these initiatives actually promotes cooperations and dialogues rather than, forming alliances. So this is something that, Southeast Asian countries really value because we don't want conflict. We want cooperation because what is important for Southeast Asian countries is development. So therefore, we basically supported all these initiatives. And talking about, this kind of GGI, I think one of the very important thing for me is one of the key concepts, which is adherence to sovereign equality. So meaning that regardless of your size, regardless of your power, regardless of the wealth of a country, you will be taken as equal and will respect. And this one for small and middle power countries in Southeast Asia is particularly significant because in the past, when we engage with big powers, superpowers, we're not being treated equally. So there are times that we have to enter into treaties or even trade agreements that probably does not benefit us. But with this kind of global governance pushed by China, which emphasize on sovereign equality, we know that we will have a say in international relations. And of course, another key concepts I think which is very important is in this GGI is to focus on real actions. So this focusing on real actions is very important because we don't want rhetoric only. So China not only introduced this kind of initiative, the idea, but there are also some other initiatives that can complement it, which can be translated into practical results. For example, like what the other panelists mentioned about Belt Road Initiative. So these are some of the existing initiatives that can actually bring real results for us in the Southeast Asian countries, and therefore we welcome and we supported GGI.
Professor Zha, so to move beyond just the proposal, initiative like the GGI needs mechanism and measures to turn its vision into reality. So what can China do to support its implementation, for instance, through multilateral platforms like BRICS and the SCO? And how can we prevent the GGI from becoming a slogan?
I think there are 4 ways China can do, rather than just coming up with another bag of money. Let's put it in a very vernacular way. One is that China must continue to put its own domestic house in greater order. There's nothing that's more valuable to the rest of the world, especially the other developing countries, in terms of China being a stable sort of trade and investment. And for that, domestic growth, especially increase in domestic demand, is so much more valuable. Nobody outside China wants handouts, even though their average income level may be lower than that of China. And second, it's that in terms of foreign policy, I think China won the de facto support or endorsement, even admiration, by saying, look, the end goal for the interaction between China and another country is to find some niche areas for both to contribute to the betterment of the society or to contribute to searching for effective growth of the economy. That rather than your system has to change to be more like mine, where you systematic change as a precondition. The third is that that's the value in the global initiative. That is to say, rather than saying my initiative, you internalize, you implement, China must practice this. That is to say, whatever initiative, whatever specific policy that involve others will go through a process of consultation, making use of these multilateral institutions, UN being one, but then we have ASEAN, we have SCO. The last one, speaking of SCO, I would think there are regions in the world that are sort of forgotten due to forces of economic geography or due to relatively lower comparative advantage, set of comparative advantage. We're talking about small island economies. We're talking about landlocked small economies, especially those in Central Asia or some of in the middle of nowhere in Latin Americas or in Africa. What else? So China should, in that sense, practice that it's people-oriented. We can't solve all the problems there. We can't be responsible for anything, but we make practice. People in those parts of the world deserve special attention. That's where Chinese development aid assistance, including skills training, should spend more efforts on. But if I come back together, is that China needs to avoid leaving the impression of saying, I have a proposal, now I have some money, and let's please demonstrate that you support my proposal and spend my money to just repeat the vocabulary. No, a lot of that attraction comes from doing the work well at home and comes through actually practicing this whole notion of equality, whole notion of conversations, and then consensus formation.
Professor Mahoney, while many developing countries have shown interest, responses from Western nations have been more cautious and mixed. In your view, how have Western countries responded to this global governance initiative so far, and what do you think is driving their reactions or concerns?
Well, I think we have to ask the question these days: what precisely is a Western country? I don't think we would perceive Japan or the Republic of Korea as Western countries. I think we're in a transitional period. I think it's clear in Europe. I think it's clear in East Asia. I think it's absolutely clear in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. I think it's clear everywhere in the world that the breakdown and the dangers or risks and the shortcomings or deficits or whatever you want to call it associated with the global governance system, these are coming to a head with the current presidential administration in Washington. But this is not his first rodeo. We saw these problems before, and certainly we saw these problems with different tactics, but still very serious problems during the Biden years. And I would say that even before all of that, if you look at the way in which the United States prosecuted what it called the war on terror, how it illegally invaded and instigated regime change in Iraq, how it grossly, abusively occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, and did so terribly that the people ultimately preferred the Taliban over the American occupation, and the U.S. abandoned that post with all of their heavy weapons in Taliban hands. So I think that there's a long-standing problem, but it's also the case that so for example, I speak with Japanese diplomats who realize they need to find a solution to the security and economic trap that they face vis-a-vis the United States. They know this, but it's very difficult to make that transition for a couple of reasons. The first is because they're so heavily invested in this relationship, this security relationship with the United States, and at the same time, at least the way it's explained to me, the private media in Japan has been ideologically aligned with the United States for so long, and has worked very, very hard to poison Japanese public opinions against China. So I think that there's this awareness among intellectuals, there's an awareness among government officials and diplomats that we are in a transitional period, but how do we get there? And again, to point out another issue, I think Japan was horrified with what just happened in Qatar, where you have a U.S. base that is supposed to be there to ensure that you don't get attacked. And that country promises you won't be attacked and that the Hamas delegation won't be attacked. But then there appears to be complicity between that country and another one. So what is the good of the, what is it's not even necessarily a security advantage. It may actually be an occupying force that is further limiting your ability to move forward into a new world order. And for better or worse, I think we see a similar situation in Europe, although, I think that unfortunately during the Biden administration, when he first came to power, he made this direct outreach to Europe, and this left, I think, him in a very incredible position to exploit the historical legacy of European fear, especially in Eastern and Central Europe, of Russia and the former Soviet Union, and to mobilize what ultimately was a proxy war between two fossil fuel dependent economies fighting over control of energy markets and how that energy is paid for. And what we've seen is that I think Europe was initially very, very resistant to getting involved, but now they're completely involved, and they're unable even to disengage to their own benefit, despite the fact that they have now a president in the White House that is much less concerned with their security or even continuing to prosecute the war in Ukraine. So to answer your question, I think intelligent people, even some governments that have previously been somewhat distant from Chinese proposals, I think they realize that this is the direction that they have to travel in. But and we may see breakthroughs. We're still holding out prospects that we're going to see a tremendous breakthrough, perhaps with a trilateral free trade agreement between the ROK, Japan, and China, and the tremendous breakthrough that we've seen between China and India, and even it's a little idealistic, but we may see some sort of a security trilateral agreement between China, Russia, and India. These things, I think, are if we count these countries that are not necessarily Western countries, but are certainly neighbors, near neighbors, close neighbors on the border with China, but also even I think European countries, I think there's a realization that this is the way to move forward. And let's be clear, I think a lot of European countries, in terms of principles, I think they probably adore the ideas that at least rhetorically adore the ideas that are being put forward by China. But again, the problem is that there's so many people that have this fundamental misunderstanding of China and want to discredit or devalue anything that comes out of it.
Then, Professor Lee, so looking to the future of global governance, what opportunities do you see for the GGI to foster inclusive governance models in Asia, particularly in areas of trade, development, and security? And how might China work with ASEAN and other neighbors to make global governance feel more inclusive and regionally grounded?
Thank you for the questions. I think, before I answer directly to questions, I just want to say why do, Southeast Asian countries or even other countries want to support GGI rather than the past global past governance system? One of the reasons was what Professor Mahoney pointed out. If you look at in the past, these countries like the US, they have been meddling in the internal affairs of other countries, like in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So trying to bring a regime change, trying to make them democratic, with the hope that, after being a democratic country, your country will be prosperous, your country will be stable. But look at Afghanistan now, look at Iraq now. They're actually not more prosperous than they were before the invasion. After the invasion. So meaning that I think what is lacking in the previous, the Western-led model is that they think that everyone should be following Western liberal democracy. But the fact is, for example, if you look at Singapore, they have been growing so well. They have so much political stability because they didn't adhere to the Western liberal democracy. In fact, their former leaders, Lee Kuan Yew, often criticized Western liberal democracy. He said that the Western values are not aligned with our Asian values. We value other things. We value political stability. We value economic growth. We value strong governance. So in the sense that why people are now rejecting the Western-led model is because this is not suiting for our national conditions. So in comparison, I think because GGI talk about multilateralism, respect for all. So meaning that every country now are given a chance to chart their own development path. They are given a chance to actually practice their culture, practice their governance, political system, which are distinct from China or even from the rest of the world, but they will be respected for it. Apart from that, if you look at the current US administration, they are weaponizing trade, weaponizing tariff, which actually includes, like what both professors say, includes, pressuring other countries to impose tariff on another country. I'll give you an example. It was reported that the EU were pressured by the US to impose a tariff on India and China because they have been buying oil from Russia. So what does it mean? It basically, we see that there's no respect for other countries' autonomy. There's no respect for other countries' sovereignty. So that's the reason why we are not keen to have this kind of governance system. But in terms of GGI, what I see are some of the corporations that can be realized in the future. As I mentioned, I think BRI projects are one that can advance GGI principles, and then one that, Southeast Asian countries, we will happily, continue implementing the BRI projects. But I think there's one confusion that needs to be clear is that a lot of people think that BRI project is Chinese-based, meaning that the kind of projects that is being implemented by the host country is the idea coming from China. But this is not true because I did a field work in Malaysia. We have this East Coast Railway link. From outside perspective, they thought that, this project must be something that comes from China. China has initiated that Malaysia built this railway project. But I went for the interview with this policymakers, they say, no, actually, the idea of building the railway has been there for decades, but then we don't have the funding. And therefore, when China say, okay, we can provide the funding and even the technology to build it, and Malaysia happily embrace it. So I think this confusion needs to be clear that all the BRI projects are not actually driven by China. So the idea of building, whether it's rail, road, or energy infrastructure, all comes from the host country. Besides that, I just have to acknowledge that, of course, there are some concerns about BRI projects, but I believe that moving forward, BRI is going to be focusing on quality, green, and sustainable projects. And I think they will be focusing on this one because this is what countries want. And this means that BRI does not only advance GGI principle, but it also going to equally help countries to achieve sustainable development goals, which has been advocated by the UN.
Professor Zha, what's your assessment of the future of global governance with China proposing this initiative? Do you think it's possible for China to build trust and cooperation across both the global south and the developed world in this context?
Well, global governance because it's global, it's a large basket that does not really have a fixed shape. I think here in China, and also we certainly does not necessarily need Chinese reminders that this is going to be a continuous process. To the extent this Chinese initiative will have buy-in, will have following, like I said, it depends on how we acted out here in China, and especially in terms of many of the issues in terms of relating to Chinese entities within the country or between the Chinese government and Chinese people. We talk about people-centered approach. That cannot just be about the external. It has to begin first and foremost internal. And how the foreign individuals and non-Chinese companies or entities are treated here in China. So it begins, we lead by action. Whether or not this will have on that basis, we'll have a better buy-in. And again, the multilateral aspect and the results-oriented. Results, meaning we have to accept that this is going to be step by step. We have to be patient. In the process, we will have competition, but I do believe this initiative will have a shot at it. In other words, and together, a mistake. The mistake that could be made along the way is for China to be impatient and start to repeat the mistake of what some would say to be a domineering or an effort at that, or even sort of colonial type of approach. So the future is open, and patience is required, and at the same time, focus on results that can be accepted by others as well.
Professor Mahoney, so what's your take on Professor Zha's remarks? And in your view, where is the global governance system likely heading in the next, say, 5 to 10 years? And how might China's role, along with the global governance initiative, influence or reshape its future direction?
I think the first thing we need here is some financial perspective. The UN budget this year is $3.72 billion. I don't have this year's operating budget for New York City, but last year's budget was $107 billion. In other words, the UN operating budget is roughly 3% of just the New York City budget. And Trump has bragged that he's now given the United States its first $1 trillion defense military budget. And he's renamed the Department of Defense the Department of War. So I think that we realize that what we have done so far in terms of global governance has been important, it's been valuable, but it has been woefully inadequate, that there is so much more that we could do. And above all, if we were less inclined to spend trillions of dollars building systems and weapons designed to kill other people. At the same time, we do realize that in the next 5 to 7 years, we anticipate some sea changes. For example, Google and other leading tech firms and research institutes predict that we will experience something that's being described as Q Day. Google says in 2030, others believe 2031, 32. But that's the day when quantum computing abilities are able to hack all of the encryption or most of the encryption that we currently use. The world is woefully unprepared for what that could mean for the global economy, what that could mean for financial security. We know that hackers around the world right now are stealing data, encrypted data, and storing it for Q-Day when they'll be able to get into it. We know that climate change is accelerating and may have tipping points and cascade effects faster than we realize. Many experts believe that the dollar will continue to be the global reserve currency maybe for the next 15 to 20 years. I think that we're also could see tipping points and cascade effects that would see the world begin to abandon the dollar at a greater rate. So we have a number of high risk situations that are on the horizon, and we desperately need a system that will be able to foster cooperation, come up with new rules and regulations for dealing with these paradigm shifting technologies, but also to ensure that old problems like nuclear proliferation are not coming back to haunt us. These are the things that they absolutely have to be done. And my sense is whether the United States likes it or not, these efforts will move forward. And I think China will certainly make a concerted effort to work with other countries to promote reform in the longstanding key institutions of the global governance system. But China will also continue to work to develop solutions that will either complement the system or that will simply pick up the slack, and whether this is BRICS or SCO or what have you. So I think China is going to help create solutions, but I do think that again, many people are aware, as I said before, that even countries that were previously more hostile to China, they realize that this is the direction that the world will move in. But I'll go back to something that Zha Daojiong said earlier, because it reminded me of a conversation that I had in Rome with some government officials who were saying, "What is China going to do to save us?" Basically, this was really the key point that came from a senior official, and it was so incredibly impotent. It was so incredibly pathetic, and I say this with some empathy, but there is unfortunately this tendency among certain countries to expect other countries to save them. And I think, unfortunately, the United States cultivated this type of culture and dependency. And it's clear that China doesn't want, as Li Laoshi was saying, Malaysia doesn't want China telling it how to do its business. And Malaysia also wants to be independent. I think these are things that Asian countries want. But I'm not sure that's what we really expect from some of these Western countries that have these long-term dependencies on the U.S. to help them move forward with their own agendas. So it's going to be difficult, I think, for some parts of the world, but it will be a no-brainer and something that other parts of the world will run towards.
With that, we're wrapping up today's program. I've been speaking with Professor Pei May, an assistant professor of political science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, Professor Zha Daojiong, a professor of international political economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University, and Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney, a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. To listen to this episode again or catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. For further discussion, you can also follow us on X at CGTN Radio. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.